Hi, everyone. My name is Natasha Mann, and I'm the Deputy Secretary of the Better Regulation Division, and I'm also the Head of SafeWork New South Wales. Thank you all so much for joining us today, as SafeWork New South Wales is hosting a really important conversation about what we're calling the healthy work approach, or healthy work, which we really see as a journey towards a more integrated and holistic approach to work health and safety in New South Wales workplaces. But before we sort of get into the thick of things, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Alicia Johnson from Revenue New South Wales, who's going to offer an acknowledgement of country. Alicia, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which we're meeting today, the Barramadagal people of the Darug Nation. We'd like to acknowledge the elders, both past and present, and acknowledge any Aboriginal people in the meeting today. Just an explanation around Barramadagal is the people, Barramada is the place, Barra meaning eel, Mada meaning place, Barramada, that's why you have the Parramatta eels. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Alicia. Sorry, I think Karen and I are having a few difficulties back here, a few technical issues, so we couldn't hear that. But thank you very much, Alicia, for that acknowledgement of country. And I would just like to say that I'm coming to you today from beautiful Gadigal land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal colleagues who are joining us today. So it is a real privilege to be here today. As I said, this is about SafeWork New South Wales kicking off and really beginning to encourage what we see as a slight shift in dialogue and thinking.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm truly blessed, and I would like to acknowledge that I come from the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation in Western Australia. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about work design. I'd just like to explain where I come from, which is the Centre for Transformative Work Design. And we are a research centre, but very committed to actually making sure that our research gets out there to try and create a better world, as we've said in our vision statement. So I want to start by talking about what is healthy work, because that is the point of today's discussion. And I will use the definition in the New South Wales Healthy Work paper that is being released today. Healthy work is when work is designed and managed in a way that does not cause harm and that has positive benefits to the physical and psychological health, safety and well-being of workers. So this is a fantastic definition because it's capturing the physical and the mental aspects of health. And it's also recognising that good health isn't just about things not being bad, so that preventing of harm, but it's also about good health being, physically fit, thriving, flourishing, and having those sort of positive elements as well. And that's really what this is mental health spectrum here. But I'm just going to show that briefly to say that when we talk about mental health, and the same applies to physical health, we really want to consider that whole spectrum. From on the left, you see the red there is mental ill health, right up to thriving. And it's all of those aspects that are important. Of course, if people have mental ill health, we need to be supporting them and accommodating them. But we also need to go further and create work environments in which people can really thrive and flourish. Today is all about total worker health. So I want to talk a little bit about how mental and physical health converge or come together. And the first thing is, of course, mental health influences physical health. So there's lots of examples up here, but just as one, if people experience chronic amounts of stress in their lives, we know from research that that has consequences for the cardiovascular system, health, heart disease, etc., but also the nervous and immune system. You can see other examples up there. I'll just go to the last one there. Also, if you have mental health problems, for example, eating disorders, then that's going to affect your physical health, of course. And it might even also affect your compliance with treatment of physical health issues. So lots of ways in which mental health influences physical health, but the reverse is also true. So physical health affects mental health. And again, just a couple of examples. If you have chronic physical conditions or injuries, that has an influence on your anxiety and your depression. And again, it can also influence your receptivity to treatment of those sorts of factors. I won't go through all of them, but this is a really important recognition of these two things influence each other. So part of the reason why the total health model is important is because of this dynamic influence. But another reason that really matters is that mental and physical health have many common determinants. So we know, for example, that trauma, poverty, social isolation, those things affect both mental health, anxiety and depression, but also they affect physical health. I'm going to focus today, though, on the role of work, and particularly well-designed or poorly designed work, as a factor that can influence both mental and physical health. And I'm going to give lots of examples of that. So I'm going to talk about work design, and many of you may have seen me give this academic definition. What is work design? It's about the content and organising of tasks, activities, relationships, and responsibilities within a job or role, or a set of jobs or roles. And that's a pretty academic definition. So I always like to share the smart work design model that we have developed, which is a sort of practical way of communicating the core elements of work design. So in a nutshell, multiple factors, and you can see many of the things that have been assessed and measured in the topic of work design, more than 30, in fact, aspects of work that are psychologically important. And we have done some statistical analyses to identify how these factors can sort of fit together. And I like to show this slide because it took me a lot of time to develop. But I'm going to unpack this model a little bit further. The 5 categories that the smart work design model focuses on is having stimulating work, having work that supports mastery, having agentic work or work with autonomy, having work that's relational, and having work that has tolerable demands. I always like to describe this as the big one right now because many workers are suffering from intolerable demands. I'm going to unpack what each of those aspects are and then give an example of how they affect physical health, mental health, and also business. For those who are interested, I won't go into detail here, but those aspects of the smart work design model map onto the commonly known psychosocial risks. So if that's the language you're more familiar with, you can make that map. For example, a common psychosocial risk is lack of control. And of course, that is the opposite, I guess, of agency in work. Work design matters for all those reasons you can see up there, for physical and mental health, for motivation, performance, and for learning and growth. And there is a huge literature on this topic, more than 5,000 articles we reviewed reasonably recently. So let's start by looking at stimulating work. And this is about having work that has a bit of variety and interest, that uses your skills, that develops your skills. It's got a bit of challenge in it, some problems that you can solve, some meaning in your work. This is really important from a psychological perspective. So you can see a picture there of a gig worker who's saying the work is just boring. There's so much time waiting. So boredom is a negative consequence of unstimulating work. I like to share the example of a French guy who sued his company not for burnout, but for bore-out because his work was in fact so boring. Interestingly, and it might seem counterintuitive, but when work is really unstimulating and boring, it actually can contribute to burnout. Because most people actually want to go to work and use their brains and develop and grow. And to not do so actually can take a psychological toll. But also, unstimulating work is important for physical health. So things like musculoskeletal injuries, accidents, fatigue are all influenced by the degree of stimulation in your work. Just as one example, a meta-analysis of 50 studies showed that really monotonous, boring, unstimulating work had longitudinal effects on back, shoulder, neck pain and extremity symptoms. So we know that if work is highly repetitive and monotonous, it's not only psychologically damaging, it also can be physically damaging. But what about in terms of business and organisational outcomes? Again, all sorts of consequences. One of the big ones is wasting talent. If you've got people in really boring work, you're probably not making the most of their potential. All sorts of other consequences. This is a study, just again as an example, of the implementation of a job rotation scheme in a Brazilian shoe company, of all things. And what you can see there highlighted is the cost of this initiative. I think it cost about $70,000 to implement. And this is the benefits of the initiative. And I think that was more than $500,000 saved per year because of the reduced absenteeism, the reduced musculoskeletal injuries, and other cost benefits of this initiative. Mastery is the next element of the model, and this is about designing work so that people can really do their work well, master their tasks. What really helps here is having clear roles and responsibilities, so clarity, getting feedback on how you're doing, and it also can help to have a sort of sense of task identity, which means sort of knowing where your work fits in the bigger picture of things. Again, lots of evidence for psychological outcomes if you do not have mastery in your work. And just there I show a meta-analysis of 33 studies, more than 19,000 individuals, that shows that if people don't have role clarity, so they don't know what they're doing, it predicts their depression in the workplace. And you can also see there some statistics about a lack of clarity and a lack of feedback for burnout. But what about mental health? Physical health. Again, evidence that if you lack clarity and feedback in your work, that can influence physical health outcomes as well. This is an example of some research done here in Australia using incident responders. So you can see a picture of some incident responders on high-speed roads. So people who had role ambiguity or a lack of mastery had more reports of near misses and secondary accidents in this very risky occupation that they are engaging in. And also, mastery is important for business and organisational outcomes. What you can see there is an intervention called ProMES. I won't go into detail, but it's an intervention that tries to improve the feedback that people get about their team and their team's performance. And you can see where that little arrow is pointing is when the intervention was introduced. And this is a meta-analysis from 83 studies. You can see a huge growth in performance when this feedback intervention was introduced. So again, a benefit for business outcomes. The third aspect of the model is agency, and this is the importance of having control or autonomy over the timing of the task, when you do your work, how you do your work, important decisions in your work. Even flexible working is an example of autonomy if you've got some agency over when you decide to work from home, when you come into the office and so on. Being involved in decision-making is another example of agency. One of the most consistent findings that we know from years of research is that if people do not have autonomy in work, they are more likely to experience burnout. And this is especially true if the work is very demanding. So having a low degree of autonomy is bad for lots of outcomes, including turnover, learning, growth, and more. But also, again, physical outcomes. This is a study actually that I was involved in where we used some large-scale data in the UK to look at various human resource practices and link them to audits of organisational injuries. And in fact, of all the different human resource practices, empowerment, which is fundamentally about giving people more agency, was the most significant predictor of low injury rates. And we could discuss more about why that is. But the bottom line is that if people have got more power and control, they're actually safer in their workplace. It's also important for business. And in the interest of time, I won't go into detail here, but you can see there one of the consequences, if you strip agency away from people, is that they don't have a sense of ownership over their work, which obviously influences performance outcomes. There's a beautiful example of the cost benefits of more agency from an initiative called Bertzorg, which is the introduction of self-managing teams, so more agentic teams in residential care in the Netherlands, which I'm happy to take questions on a bit later. But KPMG did a big analysis and showed not only benefits of this initiative for the workers, for the clients, so the aged care residents, but also huge financial benefits for organisations. R is relational. This is the importance of connection and support and inclusion, all those relational aspects of work. I don't even feel I need to say this because we all know it. But if you have poor relationships at work, harassment, even a lack of support, this is going to cause psychological pressure and stress and outcomes such as burnout. But again, relational aspects are also important for physical work. This particular study was focusing on people who'd had a permanent impairment and had put in a claim, but had returned to work. Low supervisory support was the main thing actually that drove whether people stayed in that work or whether they got another injury. Low co-worker support was also important. So support and relationships actually help people to get back to work and stay physically healthy. And again, I'll take this as a question later in the interest of time, lots of evidence that relational aspects of work can also have financial benefit. Go to the last one, T, and this is the importance of having tolerable work. And I described it as the big one before because many people do not have tolerable work at the moment. In other words, they have cognitive or emotional or physical or time-based pressures that they do not feel they're able to cope with, that are unmanageable or intolerable. And of course, these sorts of aspects of work take their toll in terms of outcomes like burnout. In fact, just was at a presentation where we were looking at the main drivers of psychological claims in workers' compensation cases. And harassment is number one. And number two is job pressures. So job demands, just too much to do, workload. Here's an example of how it affects physical health. So this is a study that looked at 90,000 workers from 1,500 organisations, and it showed that the more people had lots and lots of change, the more they were actually likely to access medications associated with insomnia, anxiety, and depression. So people are more likely to medicate when they are in highly demanding jobs. Here's another example of the benefits of dealing with these demands for businesses and organisations. So this is a study by BMW where the physical demands were getting too much for these were car manufacturing workers, getting too much for them to do their jobs. So they implemented a redesign, very small changes, but participative, involving the workforce. And they were actually able to maintain the productivity of the line, even though the workforce was mostly people over 50. So that's an example, again, of how if you pay attention to demands or work design, you get those business benefits. So in summary, what I've argued here is if we think about work design, we can use the lens of SMART. This is going to help us address not only the physical aspects of health, but also the mental aspects of health and well-being. And there's a lot of evidence also for those business benefits or those organisational outcomes. So just to conclude, we don't have time to go into depth here today, but of course there's a big question of how do we redesign work? How do we achieve all these wonderful things? And I guess I just would like to say that it's really an integrated approach, and this is really what's focused on in the paper that's being released today. It's integrated in terms of, it's multi-pronged in terms of mental and physical health and safety. And that's really important because, as I've said, that many of them have common drivers. It's integrated in terms of going from this spectrum of ill health all the way up to thriving. And again, that's important because we need to be looking at that whole spectrum. It's integrated in terms of being multi-level and multi-party. And what I mean by that is this achieving healthy work, totally healthy work, is not the responsibility of just individuals or just managers or just regulators or just professionals. It's the responsibility of all of those parties at multiple levels of analysis. And finally, by highlighting the business benefits of healthy work, hopefully organisations can move forward and adopt a more strategic perspective, a longer term, a more proactive perspective on addressing these issues because of the business benefits that can also emerge. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. Please do connect with me on LinkedIn and I look forward to seeing some questions. Thank you.
We are really being challenged by the nature of the way we work these days. Apologies for Natasha Mann dropping off. Unfortunately, she was working remotely and we've had some technical difficulties. My name is Jim Kelly. I'm the Director for Health and Safe Design at SafeWork New South Wales. Today, we've got a fantastic expert panel joining us, both online and in person in the room here in Parramatta. And it's indicative of the really challenges we're faced with the diverse way of working here in Australia today in the post-pandemic world as we go about doing things. Today, the real purpose of today's event is essentially to look at an evolution in health and safety. If you go back to the 1960s, we had very prescriptive legislation known as the Factories, Shops and Industries Act, where everything was prescribed in terms of what a duty or obligation was on an employer. Over time, our legislation has evolved and our way of thinking about how we manage health and safety in the workplace has also evolved. We now have a risk-based legislation. We've seen an evolution in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act to the Workplace Health and Safety Act. And more recently, we've got a harmonised model in terms of health and safety legislation. New South Wales, very fortunately, responding to changes over time, have also now adopted the regulations for psychological health in our latest legislation change. But today is really around looking beyond just compliance and looking at how do we design work to be both healthy and safe, to prevent harm in the workplace, but go beyond that and look at the positive benefits of good work design and good work. Because all of us know that work has numerous benefits for ourselves, both our health and our well-being in general speaking. I'm really fortunate today to have a fantastic panel, as I mentioned. I'd like to introduce a few of them. So firstly, we have Elizabeth Greenwood from the Business New South Wales. Liz, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
You've met Professor Parker, and thank you for your presentation, Sharon. I really appreciate it. We also have Duncan Young joining us here, a consultant in health and wellbeing and very much an expert in this space. Thank you, Duncan, for joining us. And online today, we've got Professor Karen Walker-Bone from Monash University. And Karen, again, thank you for dialing in and tuning in with us. Really appreciate it.
Great pleasure.
Now, as we mentioned, and as we heard from Professor Parker, the evidence and research is really strong around the value of good work design. It's so important that we get this right and we actually play a proactive role, and there's an expectation under the legislation that we play a proactive role in eliminating harm in the workplace. But the benefits of good work design is so important. Professor Karen, can you share with us a little bit about your research? I know you've done a lot of work in musculoskeletal health, but you've also done more recently in psychological health, and the connections between our physical and psychological health that are inextricably linked. Can you share a little bit about the research that you found over your years of experience?
Of course. I mean, Sharon obviously captivated it very well indeed. I think it's important that the listeners think about this for a second, that actually we are estimated to spend about 25% of our lives at work. The only thing you do more of in your life is sleep. So it's a very important part of your life. It's the time that can influence all sorts of events that happen outside of life. And if you have good experiences in your workplace, then obviously you take them home with you, and that impacts your health. These are direct effects, finances and stress, but also indirect effects, things like learning healthy behaviours, having your friends and your social activities geared around your work. So your physical health is intimately connected with your mental health, and both are affected by your work.
And mental health, physical health doesn't discriminate. We are all impacted by physical and mental health, aren't we, from time to time? And all of us, I think, have experienced the challenge of the last 3 or 4 years. It's been really challenging from the way we work and how we work for all of us, particularly for business leaders. And Liz, I'd like to throw to you from the business perspective. How have businesses coped with the challenges of the last 3 or 4 years? And what can we learn from that in terms of designing work to be healthy and safe, but for leaders and their teams?
I think it's, I was very surprised at the outset of COVID because we did a study, and then our small team actually rang every respondent to the study just to get a feel for how they were going. And what really surprised me was how adaptable business owners were. And on top of that, how concerned they were for their workers. And it was this overriding concern. So I think it's raised awareness. I think it's always been there. That awareness has always been there, but I think COVID tended to amplify it and bring it right to the front of mind for everyone.
And for once, we were talking about illness and disease in the workplace because we all had to be managing the risk of COVID, for example. But we also all had the experience of mental ill health. Mental health's a spectrum. We all have good and bad days. And I, for one, saw business leaders having a conversation about the impact it had on themselves, the impact it had on their workforce, the challenges of working in and out of lockdowns. And that has been really, really challenging for everyone involved. So it feels like now's the right time for us to be having this conversation around health and wellbeing, broadly speaking, and taking a really proactive step about making sure our workplaces thrive and are healthy and safe and productive.
I think so. I think it shows how important it is that you look after yourself as well as others within the workplace, and just be concerned, just care.
Absolutely.
You know, that's really what it boils down to.
It is, and obviously a business is only as good as the people that work in the business, and I think that's a really, really resonates when we talk about health and work design. Duncan, I might throw to you. You've been doing this for some time, a real champion of health and wellbeing in your extensive career. What can you share with us in terms of some practical steps that business leaders and others can take in an organisation to really design work to be healthy and safe?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting us here today. I think the discussion about healthy work is so critical, and the key thing I'm hearing is having conversations with people. So often the answer lies within a person. You just need to ask them and then wait for the answer. So I enjoyed a long career with Lend-Lease. I've ended up being the workplace head of health and wellbeing. And what we found over time was that wellbeing is really about a longitudinal approach. There are many things that we can do over time. So, and that breaking it down into the areas, there's the me, there's the we, and there's us. And so lots of things we're doing were to help people thrive, perform at their best at an individual level. We did a lot of motivational psychology, if you like, to visualize your best day. Do the small things that help you with your well-being every day. And we call that you're building your ideal day. So it's about equipping people to actually live their best possible lives that they can at work. Then at the rolled up next level, then you've got the leaders, the people you come in contact every day have an enormous impact on what you do every day. So teaching people really to have conversations, ask the right questions, listen for the response, create a safe platform for people to verbalise how their days are actually going. Because as you say, every day is not an awesome day, unless you start at swimming in the morning like I do.
Good start.
But, not every day is perfect, as they say. So being surrounded by people who actually care, and that's another word that we're hearing here today, just knowing that people have your back. We know in psychological health and the World Happiness Report and the grant study out of Harvard that having people around you that in times of trouble are looking for your support is really important. And that applies to the workplace. We're spending 90,000 hours of our lives there, so hopefully we've got that support. And then the higher level, we've got the governance or how the organisation supports it. And I always think the key to wellbeing is making it frictionless. Again, in big companies that I've seen, we make our workplaces healthy. So, the Tim Tams are gone, but the fruit bowls are there as a result. The stairs are next to the lift. So we just want to help people make the right choices every day. So that frictionless piece, creating space for people to come together, have those conversations, really important. So in all those three areas, the me, the we and the us, I think if we have these conversations and we can really move the agenda forward. And remember, it's not the prevention of illness that we're talking about today, it's the promotion of well-being and doing small things well, doing, the small things we do every time intentionally make a really big difference over time.
Doc, I hear a number of the SMART principles that you talked about, Sharon, in your presentation earlier, the relational benefits that we get out of work design, the importance of stimulating work and how valuable that is for us. Is there anything you wanted to expand on in relation to that?
Look, I think that's great. And I certainly think that thinking about the small things people can do every day, managers can do every day, I guess what I would add to that is the importance of the system in which they are trying to do it. And unfortunately, that is sometimes quite prohibitive. I mentioned earlier some of the work that we're doing in the aged care context. So absolutely profoundly critical work, but huge compliance demands for these people. We know we've interviewed people who literally run. They say this is a run day today because of illness or burnout, people are not turning up and then they have to run from client to client. So my argument is that we need to be looking at those job demands and creating a better work system for them. So they don't need stairs to climb up because they're running all day.
That's right.
So I think if we bring together, what you've suggested around individuals taking responsibility, managers behaving in the right sorts of ways, and add it to creating work systems, then we start to get closer. And I guess having a regulatory framework too. Then I think we get that total holistic sort of integrated approach that I was advocating.
I think that's exactly what we're talking about. And the impact it has, we all have high job demands, but if we're doing that on a day in and day out basis, we can't sustain that long term.
Yep.
So that leads to absenteeism if it doesn't lead to workers' compensation claims and costs and an impact to the individual and to the business itself. So I can't stress enough how important healthy work is to make sure we design work to be healthy. I should say for our listeners, we are fielding live questions throughout this session today. So please jump on Slido and put through your questions so that that we can try and answer them on the panel as best we can. Karen, I wanted to throw back to you. You've done a bit of work for us on this principles paper that we're about to launch on the back of our event, because we really want to start the conversation around what are the principles of healthy work, how do we apply it in practice, and really want to listen to the New South Wales employers and workplaces about what we can do to try and support and assist a healthy work approach in New South Wales. Is there anything you'd like to shed in terms of how we went about those principles and what makes them resonate, I suppose, for this topic?
Sure. I mean, obviously, there's an evidence point of view. So starting from the research and starting from the academic literature about what works, and a lot of what Sharon's captured this morning is informing that. But also then trying to make it simple and accessible for an employer in any size business with any number of employees. And this is challenging. So, it will be different in different settings. I think what I try and do is simplify it down to the voice of the workers. It's so key if we're going to make a healthy work impact that we are listening. And I think all our speakers have said the same thing in different ways today. We can't run a business in a command and control model and have healthy work. We really do need to listen to our employees, find out from them how to make work healthier for them. And with working together, we can then actually end up with an ultimately better working environment, which is more productive.
So critical in it, that relationship, the consultation and effective worker participation is so critical to how you manage and design work. We've got a question that's come in from Pavinda. How do you bring about workplace change when staff and the institution are set in their ways? Real change management question, Liz. I might throw this one your way as an experience.
Excuse me, I didn't have a healthy workplace and I've been exposed to mould.
Oh.
So, yes.
But managing change in organisations is so challenging.
Change management it's actually quite basic. It's talking to your employees. Work smarter, not harder. And the command and control, it doesn't work. It only works if the boss or the leader has all the answers. But it's the employees who actually have really good suggestions. I once managed a call centre And one of the students there, so they were all uni students and working casually, she came up to me and she said, Liz, there are 20 of us and we don't really know each other. So I've got a suggestion for little competitions so we all get to know each other, because they were coming, sitting in their cubicle and quite disengaged and felt quite awkward. So we had these little competitions going, you know, baby photos, formal photos. You had to guess who was who. And it was a running theme. And so it meant that on each day, each employee who came in, they were looking forward to finding out who that person was, or, you know, who the other one was. But it's talking to employees and asking for suggestions. And it might not be apparent. So that example in the aged care facility, if you literally don't have enough people, then it might have to be a run day. However, if when people come to work, say the manager sat them down and said, right, we're really understaffed today. What do you think are the priorities? How do you think we should manage it? And actually give them the opportunity to make a suggestion. Someone or a group of people might be able to come up with a really innovative way of managing the workload.
Again, consultation is key to that, isn't it?
Yes.
That's where you're going to get the answers from.
And consultation is simply communication and asking for opinions. It's not a formal process.
And when it comes to change, bringing people on the journey, because often business leaders make the decision in closed doors, it's bringing on people, and that's where things will go pear-shaped, I think.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
And of course, on top of that, you've got the bright spots. So if you're seeing things that are working already, that momentum or that progress actually gives you a head start and makes it easier for that change to implement the change.
And if you highlight it too, I remember going to a luncheon where this lady was talking about positive psychology, and it was reframing the questions. So she was giving an example of picking up kids from work. And what did you do today? Nothing. No. And then reframing the question of what was a really good thing, what was really fun, or having a more pointed question. And then she translated it into the workplace. And she said, at the end of the day, you can sit down with everyone and say, what worked well, and get everyone talking. Okay, what didn't work so well, get that off their chest, and then how do we do it better? How do we do it better for next time?
I've got a question from Heidi. Thank you, Heidi, for your question. It's really looking at more practical examples of what good work design. We often throw this word around. It's a bit of a buzzword, I suppose. But in practice, when have you seen work design work well? And I know you've done a lot of work in construction space, Duncan. So can you share a little bit in the construction industry?
Okay, so where I see things working well when it comes to good well-being is alignment. So where everyone has the ability to influence across. So it's multi-level leadership is one thing, but it's aligning people's mission or purpose in life with what they're doing. So if you roll that up into a company, at Lendlease's, we build places where people thrive, communities thrive. So it's very easy to roll up your well-being programs to help the people who are occupying our space, the employees, to help them thrive in life. So it was easy to roll in, the positive psychology, Build Your Ideal Day was one of the programs we had, helping people design their own bespoke wellbeing programs so they could do one thing, one healthy thing for themselves every day. So again, it's just looking at those little things that work, the alignment overall in the company, multi-level leadership, access to all the different programs. So a person sitting in a large corporate office has a different need to a blue-collar worker who's out on site on, say, a railway or a infrastructure project. So allowing everyone access to it, making it fun. Like this work should be fun. We want our life to be a happy, engaging place. So think a bit left field about how we engage people over time. Make it really small. Again, marginal gains make an enormous difference over time. 1% change made daily over an entire year leads to a 37 time improvement. So just looking at the small things we can all do each day, and whether that's just acknowledging someone in the lift, not looking at your phone in the lift and starting a conversation, it could be as simple as that, or it could be a bigger piece about workplace design, could influence thousands of people how they live and work. So
I think it's about recognising people are individuals as well.
Yes.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. You really have to design work to allow for some flexibility for the individuals that you're working with. And,
Correct.
And I should acknowledge we had to be flexible this morning. Natasha Flores from Union New South Wales was one of our guests, and unfortunately she couldn't make it today because she had to deal with a family emergency. But it's just another example around one size doesn't fit all. We can't always work we expect people to work around boundaries because life happens. Work and home life are very much inextricably linked, like physical and psychological health and linked. And now more than ever, and I might throw this one to yourself, Karen, now more than ever, we're working from home, we're working remotely, we carry our phone with us 24/7. So it's not as easy as knocking off at 9 o'clock, starting at 9 and knocking off at 5. How does the changing way we work in a hybrid fashion, we work 24/7, we work in the gig economy space, some of us now too. How do we design work around that changing way of work?
It's a really good point, and I think we don't know the answers to all of that. But I think, again, that we go back to basic principles of listening to the people doing the work. I think still we have to think about social contact and regular contact from line management and training and setting up the working environment if it's in different people's homes so that it's still safe and effective. So during COVID, the two initiatives that showed the best benefit for mental health were a regular line manager contact, that was at least weekly, and setting aside time for individuals to train to set up their workplaces as well as possible for their needs.
Again, it's that engagement piece, but also recognising that working from home doesn't work for everyone either. Full-time working from home doesn't work. Working in the office, the hybrid way of working, is negotiating individually, I think, in a lot of ways, about the unique circumstances of the business. What does the business need? What does the individual need? And how can they both be accommodated to suit that particular team?
And if I can jump onto that one, Jim, I think, again, it is a little about sort of principles too, because, there's no perfect solution for everybody. But if people have some agency, so they have some control over when they work from home and when they don't. But there's a trade-off because work is also relational. They are in the SMART model, which means there might be some need for compromise around coming in on days where the rest of the team is on, which will then enhance their social contact and stuff. So we've used the SMART model to sort of look at work during COVID. So one of the pieces of research that we did was a 15-wave study where we measured about 1,000 workers 15 times across the period of lockdown and beyond. And we found, interestingly, there were about 80% of people in that positive category that you talked about before, Liz, where, people... they started off a bit stressed, but over time they learned, they adapted, they got the training on their equipment and all those things. But there were about 20% of people whose mental health was poorer to begin with, and it got worse and worse and worse. And those people they were either really underloaded in their work, so non-stimulated, or really overloaded, or really micromanaged. So, the agency piece wasn't there. They had bosses. We had stories of bosses calling people constantly to check they're at their desk, and people felt more controlled and micromanaged than ever because their managers were not trusting them that they were actually working. So we had great pockets of positive examples, but we also see that that the design of work still matters, whether people are working at home or in the office. And we use the SMART model as just a very simple framework for thinking about creating good work that's hybrid across both of those. Yeah.
There's a great follow-up question to this one, Sharon, as well, from Kat, about do you have to hit all elements of the SMART work design? Because some jobs just don't have the capacity to have a whole lot of agency. Prison officers is the example that's been provided. They've got to be on site. They can't work from home.
Yep.
They've got to be there at certain times and shifts and all the rest of it. So can you make up for work design through other elements, perhaps?
First of all, you should look at it holistically, and I'll give some examples in a minute. But with the prison example, so they may not have agency around flexible working from home, and that's true of a lot of people, nurses and so on. But they can still have agency within their work, in terms of making suggestions, having voice, being heard, influencing decisions, being consulted about change. So those things are all still really, really important. But I mean, I guess the goal is to try and have, our research shows that all of those elements are important, but they work together holistically. And sometimes you do have to trade things off. So I would say with working from home, there's a bit of a trade-off between agency. You know, you've got lots of autonomy usually when you work from home, but also your relational aspect is lower. And we did a study actually that showed that support from colleagues when you're in the office is actually the best predictor of loneliness. So, you know, there's a trade-off there. But the other way to look at the SMART model holistically is around demands. So we talked about the importance of having demands that are tolerable. And we get the question all the time, well, how do we do that? Well, one solution is to reduce the demands. So going back to what you said earlier, sometimes there's not enough staff, so get more staff, that reduces the demands. Sometimes you cannot reduce the demands in certain sorts of work. Ambulance officers, for example, you know, that is a very demanding job. You can't really change some aspects of that, but you can change the SMAR. And research shows that if people have got really demanding work, but they've also got some agency, control, influence, that helps. If they've got support, so they've got that relational thing, you know, think about the paramedic who's come off a traumatic incident. Have they got a supportive manager who says, go and have a cup of tea, chat with you? Or, you know, are they pushed straight out back on the road again because KPIs measure ambulance time on the road? You know, so the other aspects actually can be shifted to make the demands feel more tolerable. So that's another way in which the model is holistic.
That job demands, job resources model is something we often talk about.
It comes into that, basically.
When we talk about our psychosocial hazards in our code of practice. So we called out a number of psych hazards that we all experience from day to day. You can't eliminate those hazards necessarily from a workplace.
Yeah.
But it's how you provide the job resources to support people through those tough times when they have high job demands, or how do they resolve conflict when conflict does arise, because it will arise from time to time in the workplace. Liz, I know you did a lot of work with us on developing that code of practice over the years.
Yes.
Any insights from your experience from a business perspective, particularly around that job demands versus job resources model, and how you get the balance right and how it shifts from time to time, I suppose?
I think in that respect, I think a lot of, I mean, when we were developing that code of practice, you know, it was quite apparent from all the people around that small business, the risks and you know, the costs and the benefits of small business were very different from
government
and big business. So, and then when you look at each business, different industries have their own stresses and you know, characteristics. So I think perhaps the best way to help businesses, I think, is to give examples if you can. I mean, I'm always after examples, and that's why at the back of the code, with those examples that we put in the appendix, that is really helpful, because you can hear members who say, yeah, well, that's fine for that type of business, but how do I do it? You know, what do I do? So the more assistance they can get, and luckily through SafeWork, again, you took on board the feedback and you've got that coaching for the managers and the workers through the Mentally Healthy Workplaces strategy. So it's just recognising the differences and being prepared to learn from others and talking to your employees. How can we do this better? You're all in it together.
We like to think that we did some good work design in our development of that code of practice, Liz, through effective consultation and stakeholder engagement. And it certainly has resonated. The feedback we've received over the last 18 months has been overwhelmingly positive. And I think things like the case studies really made a difference to make sure that resonated to all parties in a work environment. So for those that are listening, if you haven't had a look at our managing psychosocial hazards in the workplace code of practice, I'd absolutely encourage you to do so. It's really practical. It calls out some of the hazards that the law expects you to manage in a workplace, and it also has some really good case studies, as Liz touched on, that provides practical examples of how you manage those risks in the workplace. Karen, I might throw this one to you. This is really about ergonomics for people who are working from home. So obviously businesses have faced this challenge almost overnight, that all of a sudden all these people started working from home, had to worry about ergonomic issues in the home environment. Employers are dealing with an environment they can't control. Some have loaned equipment, some have purchased equipment, some have come up with other arrangements. Now we've got people in a situation where they're working from home half the week and in the office half the week. Businesses are being expected to pay for sometimes double everything because people want a laptop and a desktop. Any advice or suggestions on how businesses can design work to be ergonomically healthy and safe when people are working in random locations from time to time, the coffee shop on many occasions for small business operators?
Yeah, I mean, it really is a challenge. I think I would want to stress that the key ingredient of ergonomics sometimes is not just the placement of the keyboard and the placement of the screen. It's the fact that someone cares about your keyboard and your screen, or whether or not you can lift the weight that you've been expected to lift, and so on. So actually, it's managing the individual who's got to do that work from that setting and taking an interest in how they're coping and asking whether they're getting the support that they need and trying to signpost them to the right sorts of support, if necessary, is as important as actually the design of that work itself.
I completely agree. I think it's consulting with the workers and also making sure they're not exposed to whatever it is they're exposed to for long periods of time, whether it be the keyboard, the mouse, or other kind of work demands. Duncan?
Yeah, we can sort of add to that. We did the largest public study of workplace sedentary activities. We put ActiPal on 157 people. We collected thousands of days of data, how people sat, slept, sit to stand transitions, etc. So we designed a whole workplace that had, sitting height, standing height, sit, stand. But what we found, some of the biggest impacts were when we guided people about how they might work differently. So how might you do a walking meeting, even if you were remote walking, or how the sit to stand transition was actually even more important than an ergonomic setup. So it was a feeding, again, making change frictionless. So not only getting the right setup, which is super important, but giving people the tools that they can use to make it easy for them to implement. And over time, we had a significantly, scientifically significant change in people's prolonged sitting and an increase in purposeful walking. And that was largely just because we gave them the science behind why it's important for your work, for your health. We gave them the tools and off they went. They found their own way. We gave them autonomy to choose how they work in that respect. It made a really big difference. And people still talk about the stand-up Lend-Lease, which was Baker IDI, so David Dunstan. So getting the science behind it and making it work made a big difference.
It's a great example of where designing the physical work environment through the equipment, considering the psychological work demands that have been placed on the individuals, as Karen touched on, psychological health and musculoskeletal disorders and injuries and illnesses is really prevalent. And we've seen some great research out of the Centre for Work Health and Safety that SafeWork leads is really drawing that connection really strongly too, but also showing that you care and support your workforce. Yeah. That exercise in its own right makes a difference, doesn't it? Yeah, and it turned out being an in-house joke, like the CEO would say, every time I see you, Duncan, I feel I need to stand up. So it became a running commentary that, it actually wasn't about standing, it wasn't about sitting, it's just about moving more. So we lifted the whole mood and started a conversation about what worked for the individual, and that was the main thing about the autonomy to do what works for you.
And caring, I think, we're not saying rush out and give every employee a hug, and offer a cup of coffee. It's just common courtesy.
Yep.
Yes.
It's
showing interest in the person, isn't it, really?
Active listening.
Just saying good morning and goodbye and have a nice night is so, it's meaningful and it's so easy to do. If
people feel valued, then they'll return that value to the business and to the customer's experience as well.
Mm. Yep.
There's a question here from Carl about, is there a business maturity model that measures where a business is at in terms of the work design journey? Sharon?
Yeah, I think we have a Thrive at Work framework, which the National Mental Health Initiative sort of aligns with as well, and Tony LaMontagne's work aligns with. And that has 3 elements, which is sort of related to maturity, I think. So the first is mitigate illness. And that is really recognising that in many organisations there are already people who are struggling, suffering, and we must first attend to those. Those are things like making sure there's access to counselling, making sure people feel safe to speak out if they've got a problem, making sure supervisors can know and recognise if somebody is having a challenge and so on. But that's sort of the starting point. Then, in a sense, really we need to move to that prevent harm space, which is what today is all about, which is really saying, you know, let's not just have the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, let's put the fence around the cliff to stop people falling off. And so that's about creating work that's healthy. That does take a level of maturity. I think that organisations some are reaching now, and it's actually great because the conversation has shifted from just let's make sure we've got the supports in place for people who are not well to let's actually create good work and prevent that harm. And then, of course, the even more mature, I suppose, is to go to that let's create work in which people are just not getting ill, but people are thriving, flourishing, you know, bringing their whole self to work, being creative, being innovative, actually doing the things humans are best at, complex problem solving and stuff, you know, because we know with the future work that a lot of the routine work will be digitalised. So let's create environments in which humans can really bring the best of their human skills. And that's a sort of another level of readiness, I think. So that model can be sort of used like that to sort of see where an organisation is at. Yeah.
It would be remiss of me not to mention some of the work we've been doing in the mentally healthy workplaces space over the last 4 or 5 years. So the SafeWork team have really invested time, effort and resources to make sure that businesses have a real focus on mental health, which obviously one element of healthy work, not the be-all and end-all, but it's something we really felt 5 years ago we needed to do a lot of attention on. And we've progressed from there, we've matured from there. But one of the tools we did develop was a benchmarking tool, which essentially benchmarks where a business is at in terms of that mentally healthy journey. And we've created a number of tools, but the one that we've just recently is really comprehensive workplace wellbeing assessment that helps a business survey their staff, their workers and leaders and their HR professionals to get a snapshot of where you are on this benchmarking tool and actually compare you against your industry average and the state-based average. So really encourage people to have a look at the SafeWork NSW's website for those resources around workplace wellbeing assessments.
It's a great another way, if I can just say, of asking the worker. I mean, if you're a small organisation, you can walk around and chat, but, you know, this is a sort of systematic way of doing that.
Your 3 staff.
Yeah.
You know, you just can't do that. But you can have one-on-one conversations.
Absolutely.
How are you going? How's your weekend? How are you finding this?
Yeah.
So this tool is designed for all size businesses with about 8 or more, I think is the minimum number. But what it does do is actually use the evidence and research that we've gained over the years and compare it against similar sized businesses, which shows you the journey and the steps and the action plan you need to take to move up the scale of maturity and capability. Yeah. So it's a fantastic tool to start with. It is complementary to your other health and safety management systems. And I think something we haven't really touched on today is that, as I mentioned back in the 60s, we had the Shops, Factories and Industries Act. That's around hazard identification, the physical hazards in the workplace, the safety culture, the safety management systems. And really that's the foundation of good work design and healthy work. You have to start there first before you can start to build beyond harm prevention to wellness.
You get the basics right.
Duncan, again, construction industry, you've worked in that space before where the fatal risk consequences are really significant.
Yes.
How do you manage the culture between the fatal consequences and managing the fall from heights issue with the health and wellbeing strategy at the same time?
Well, they're related things, but they're different in some respects. So, you know, there's the physical things you can do to prevent injury by not having, you know, the circumstance that can happen on site. So it's not just a guardrail, you're not doing any work at height, for example. So all those kind of things, but largely, you know, accidents happen from people, you know, either harm happening to a person. So it's about helping people understand the different things they do. You know, psychosocial element of mental health, first aid, mates in construction, all those kind of things really pushed awareness that it was okay not to be okay, to put your hand up and things like that. So there's a physical elimination of risk. So it's literally, there should be no incidents, you know, so it's taking out, and then it's the skilling up of your teams to actually put their hand up if they're not okay, share their stories with others, and that's a really important bit. So getting the right people in to help you, using the science, and then of course the people who are doing the work are the main ones to showcase it on sites.
I think you touched on there is a connection there, isn't there? If people aren't managing their health, if the workplace is contributing to poor health, that their high job demands, for example, they're working long hours, it's impacting on their sleep at night, so they're turning up to work more fatigued. They may be resorting to drugs and alcohol and other means of managing their stress levels that they're not managing. Whether that's work or non-work related, there's a fitness for duty assessment that an employer has to do when they start the job. Because if you put someone up on a roof or working at height or working in operating plant machinery, working near plant machinery, they're far more likely for a workplace serious incident to occur. And often a lot of those factors are psychosocial factors, whether it be how they're coping with work life or home life. The link is really, really strong, and it's something I'm really committed to in terms of this evolution of health and safety, is that we start to think more holistically. And whilst the workplace is not responsible for what people do on their weekends, they do need to consider what they would do on the weekends, how that impacts on their performance at work on a Monday morning. And that assessment of fitness for duty is really important, and that care and concern will help prevent injuries in the workplace.
I think there are two things there. I think one is everyone has to have they're responsible for themselves. And I think that message really needs to be stressed. And I think others should look out for, especially young workers, and on building sites. So instead of saying, the WHS, that's just forget all that, we've got a job to do. It's more or less, well, hang on, look at what you're doing. That's a nail gun. You're about to shoot yourself in the foot. So don't do that. And keeping an eye out for everyone. But I'm glad you actually raised the fitness for work, because this is one of my concerns. With the regulatory framework, there are other pieces of legislation. So you've got discrimination. And there was a case that the employer was very concerned about the way a worker was behaving, and actually asked that person to go see a doctor and just make sure that they're okay. That worker took the employer to the Anti-Discrimination Tribunal and won. So that fitness for work, I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and messaging and awareness, basically. And, so a worker, if you're being asked to go and get a certificate of capacity, it's not a question of being judged. It comes from a place of genuine concern. So how do you convey that message, and how do you take that message on board?
And I think obviously businesses need to seek their own legal advice and examples like that, but it has to come from that genuine concern and care that we do not want to place you at harm. And if we think you're impaired in some way, shape or form, then it's our duty and obligation to make sure you are not risk to yourself or others in the workplace.
But I read somewhere with the younger generation, things like a thumbs up was aggressive. So I think also with the generational differences, we need to understand each other a bit better. And if something's concerning you, speak up and say that you're concerned about something.
I think it does, again, it's sort of this multi-responsibility, because I absolutely agree with you. Individuals need to look after their own health, and we need to encourage them to speak up. But I'm also, when you were talking, Jim, I was thinking of, for example, we've done a lot of work with FIFO workers, and they have very high rates of suicide, extremely high levels of psychological distress. And we have a lot of conversations with business people and unions, who have very different perspectives. And on the one hand, the business, sometimes the business perspective is, it's we've got to sort of not recruit people who can't cope, etc. And then the other side of it is that actually, what is it about their work that is causing them not to cope? And for example, rosters, our research and others shows very, very clearly if you're away from home for 5 weeks and come home for 2 weeks, your psychological distress is far worse than if you are away for 1 week and come home for 1 week. And of course, it's mostly the managers that it's 1 week, whereas the blue-collar workers are the 5 week, 1 week. That is a system. That's what I mean by work design. So no matter how individually responsible that person is, they're going to be away from their young family. It's going to cause stress in their partnership. You know, we also have to try and create systems that people can be as responsible as possible within. So I just would add that piece to the equation.
I'm such a big believer in that. Like the example I used about weekends and how they impact on your Monday performance, the same goes the reverse. What does the impact of work on your home life, and how does that create a cycle? And we talked about job demands and work resources before. When home life is going well and work's not going so well, you can generally cope. But when work life and home life aren't going well, that's when real issues concern. And we see that time and time again. So it's a cycle. It's interlinked, and we really got to do a lot of work on it. Karen, I can see you nodding away, and I'm really interested to get your thoughts on particularly on Sharon's comments around designing rosters and shifts and work. We've had a lot of talk around the 4-day working week that's been floating around the world at the moment, and a couple of positive suggestions around that. We've seen ourselves construction work businesses go from 6 days to 5 days, and the result that's made for their workforce and their productivity has been astounding. Any thoughts or experience from yourself around designing work and shifts and rosters?
So I actually want to sort of slightly move away from that topic into the importance of, I really want to challenge people listening here. Traditionally, well-being's been a rather tacked off little aspect of what might be done in the organisation. Perhaps somebody in HR has got responsibility for the well-being initiatives. What I really want to impart to the listener is the importance of actually leadership buying into this, mattering to their business, and that their employees matter to them. And the example that you've just heard there about, we know by evidence which is the best shift pattern for the psychological safety of workers. If the employer knows that that's best for their employees, they should be doing it. But if their bottom line is threatened by that, it's going to cost them more money, they may not think they want to do that. And this is where really we need to see change in how businesses think about things. And in the short term, they might lose money, but in the longer term, they might gain a great deal by investing and actually putting their money where their mouth is and leading this change.
Yeah, very valid points, Karen. And it also kind of builds on a question I got from Eugene around, obviously we focus a lot on businesses and doing that partly because we're driven by, as a regulator, SafeWork, the obligation is on the business and on the leaders of the business. But there's also a role to play for employees and workers in these organisations too. And how does a business enable employees and workers to flourish, I suppose, to tap into all the resources that the workplace makes available to them? And how do they necessarily take responsibility for their health as well? Because that's a really important part. We do rely on individuals to know at times when enough is enough, and to communicate to the business and let them know when they're having a tough time and they need a break and support and assistance. Yes. Anyone want to comment on that one?
This feels to me like your topic.
It sounds like Duncan, doesn't it?
So there's sort of in simple terms, and this is just the theory I've come up with, that there's a 3-tier approach when you're engaging with individuals. So building awareness, so that's podcasting, that's talks, that's giving them information to get them excited about why wellbeing matters and the link between health and productivity. And then there's a middle bit, which is really about fostering curiosity. You either give them heart rate variability monitors, you give them surveys, biometrics, so they can actually see how they're performing. When you see your own data, suddenly it makes more interest. And then, of course, embedding habit change over time. So awareness alone doesn't equal change. We do a lot of work on trying to understand a strength-based approach to change. So what am I good at? So I'm no good at spelling, but I'm really good at talking. But what gives me strength? What gives me the kind of energy? So when you map all those 3 things, at the end of the day, you get to the end and you go into what we call an active learning loop. We've tried something. How did it go? What might we amend? What might we start again? Well-being is something you never get to the top of. This is constantly evolving. And you might try some stuff, it doesn't work, you adjust it and you try again. So I'd encourage everyone just to think small, intentional choice make a big difference over time, and just start trying stuff, get an open forum whether it's working for you or not. Because when you get ahead of steam and people see that progress, everyone progresses together, and that's what we want, assuming we've got the right framework and support around them in the beginning, which I've heard so much about today.
I think that reminds me, Duncan, of behavioural science, behavioural insights kind of theory, and there's a really simple acronym which I try and remember, the EAST acronym, which if you want to nudge people, you want to create behaviour change, you make things easy for them.
Yes.
And a great example, and I don't like to use the whole yogurt and fruit bowls examples, but this is a great example of it. A bowl of apples, if you make it easy for people to get an apple, then they're more likely to eat it. A is for attractive. If it's a nice, shiny red apple, you're more likely to eat it than an apple that's a week old or two.
Yes.
So you want something to be easy and attractive.
Yep.
You want to make it socially acceptable. If everyone else is eating apples, then I'm more likely to eat an apple.
Yes. Yeah.
Like it's normalising the behaviour. And I think you touched on that in what you're saying. And it also needs to be timely. There's no point in putting apples out at 10 o'clock at night when no one's going to eat apples. You put it out at morning tea time when people feel like they need an apple. Yep. So easy, attractive, socially acceptable and timely is a really basic nudge theory that I find so useful in whenever I'm trying to encourage behaviour change in any organisation, really.
Yeah,
Can I just comment on the individual perspective in terms of work design? Because, you mentioned earlier doing a podcast on job crafting. And, there's many decades of research now on this concept of crafting your own work design. So if you take the SMART model, if you're bored, what can you do to ask for more interesting projects or negotiate with your boss to get a bit more agency or whatever. So I think also having people understand this concept of crafting, knowing that they have permission and are encouraged by their managers and bosses to do that. This is a way that people can create, to some extent, their own work design to fit their particular skills, interests, abilities, and so on. And we have a lot of evidence, actually, that if you actually train people how to craft, because a lot of the time people sort of intuitively know, but they don't put a lot of time into thinking about it. But if you train people and give them the space and the skills and some of these principles around behaviour change, people can learn to craft more successfully and be more engaged and have better mental health and wellbeing as a result.
Couldn't have said it better. I'm really conscious of time. We're going to start to wrap up, but I might give everyone a chance just to say some final words, I suppose, for the audience before we do our concluding remarks. Karen, would you like to kick off?
Sure, thank you. I think the only other point I would like to make is around trust. And these things work if there's mutual trust between employer and worker. So the listening piece has to happen, but then they have to follow through.
And creating an environment for trust is so important, isn't it? I think that's a fantastic way of summing up. Liz, any thoughts?
I think cooperation. You're a team. Businesses are there. Yes, they're there to make money, but they can only make money if they are productive, because you're there to provide a good or a service. And that's why you have everyone together, working together. So you're a team. A lot of this stuff's management 101, really. So it really shouldn't be that hard. But if you keep that team mindset, I think that will go a long way.
And I genuinely believe businesses want their workers to be healthy, safe and productive.
Yes, they do.
They don't want to be sole traders. They want to be a business.
They do, because they can't do everything themselves. They need their workers, and that came out in COVID. It's like a lot of people saying, "Do I take JobKeeper or should I encourage them to go on the dole because I don't want to shortchange them? So what do I do?" That concern is there. It's just tapping into it.
And sometimes they don't always know how, and they don't know where the resources are.
I think that's the biggest thing. The biggest thing. For example, your evidence that you presented, I'm currently kicking off a project to do with mental health and managing mental health in the workplace. A lot of the evidence that I'm looking at is older than 2021. So there's evidence that you're presenting that the evidence that I've found have said, well, there's no proof either way, whereas you've just presented something and said, well, yes, we know this and we know that. So I guess if we can all work together and get the information out there, and as much as possible, everyone, have that thirst for knowledge.
And I think that's something that SafeWork as a regulator will start to do, is make these resources accessible. I know there's a lot of information available in your Centre for Transformative Work Design.
Yep.
Sharon, we did have a question saying where can I get more information about the smart work design model? So
yeah,
that would be
we have a website called smartworkdesign.com.au, I think.
And that's the problem, though, going to all these different websites and finding it.
So we will certainly take that on board and actually use that as part of our plan as we develop a strategy moving forward, which is really what today's all about. Any final words, Sharon?
I think I just wanted to return to that question about sort of practical examples, and I do love the work that SafeWork has done in this space, by the way. It's excellent. I think I would just recognise that, you know, work design is a very big topic, and it can be progressed in sort of small, tiny ways. The conversation, you know, for example, a lot of people will use the SMART model just as a conversation starter with their team. Very simple. But it can also be a more profound, radical change, like changing rosters or reducing hierarchy and bureaucracy in organisations. So there are sort of multiple strategies, I guess. You know, so it depends where people are coming from. Small business, different sort of strategy, but the principles are the same. And that's a point that Karen's been making. I think it's really important that, you know, the principles here is what matters. Principles of smart work or work of voice or trust, that's what really matters. But then the way that you execute them can vary according to scale and size of the problem and so on and so forth.
And I think it's really important that people, business leaders and managers and anyone who manages people, realise that they design and redesign work every day of the week.
Yeah, exactly.
A new person starts, you sit down with a role description, you talk about what is the role that you're asking them to do. That's an opportunity for job design.
And one of the things that we've done, sorry, I know we've not got much time, but for example, is embed the SMART framework into performance appraisal discussions.
Yes.
Because it's a great opportunity to focus not on any deficiencies of the person, but on the work itself and how is it enabling you to be performing at your best. And that very simple change can have quite a radical difference in terms of creating better work.
So design and redesign on a regular basis using the SMART model, I think that's what I take out of that. Sharon.
Yeah.
Duncan.
Whoops, that was aggressive.
And I'm going to say be curious, you know, and look for the bright spots in life. So there are many things that didn't work through COVID, but we know through the surveys that pro-social activities, so kindness, helping strangers, benevolence and donations all increased. I think there's lots of positive stuff going on. We just need to build on it. I consider the big picture, but build on the small intentional things we do each day, because people are observing our actions, and if we can be the leadership model, then that's great.
Thank you. We've developed a principles paper, as I mentioned, with the help of Karen. It's a simple paper, only a couple of pages, with 7 key principles for healthy work. And we really encourage you to go and have a read of that paper and to have your say, to start to continue the conversation. We've kicked off the conversation today, and it really is an evolution, as we talked about, of health, safety and wellbeing in the workplace. We want to see this conversation continue. So on the screen, you can see you have the SAVE platform. This is an online platform where there's an opportunity to provide answer some questions in terms of what you think about the principles paper and the principles of healthy work. There's an opportunity there for sharing examples and ideas of how do you design healthy work. So we want to hear about best practices, examples that are out there, examples that you've experienced in your own working lives that demonstrate good work design in practice. We also want to get some feedback and ideas and suggestions on what our strategy might look like if we develop a strategy next year. We think this is a longer term vision. We want to see all New South Wales businesses designing work to be healthy and safe. So we really welcome your feedback and input, and are looking forward to continuing this conversation next year and beyond. So I'd like to thank all our speakers today. Really appreciate the expertise that we've been able to get on our panel online. And for those that weren't able to make it, Natasha dropping off early on, thank you for our listeners and staying engaged in this hybrid way of working. It is challenging. I recognise all businesses are going through these different challenges, but there's a fantastic opportunity to continue to evolve the way we think about health, safety and wellbeing in the workplace. At the end of the day, what we want is our workers to be healthy, safe and productive, and our businesses will see the results in that as well. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your engagement today, and thank you for the panel.